Once the pandemic ended, we fell into a period of high inflation where the cost of living hit many communities throughout Britain. Wage increases did not meet the rise of high inflation. Workers used their right to withdraw their labour in many public sector jobs, such as the NHS and the teaching profession. Within the debt advice sector, debt advisors themselves began to organize for the first time in living memory due to stress at work and high targets. Save Debt Advice campaign was therefore launched by Unite the Union and others to address the challenges faced by the debt advice sector in times of the cost of living crisis. To talk about this month's episode on Debt Talk on the following subject: debt advice, money advice and pension service, and advisors. I have a former debt advisor who previously worked for State Change, Tanis Belsham Wray. Tanis will share her personal experience of why she left working for the advice charity. I also have Tamra Manning, co-CEO of Talking Money. Talking Money is an advice charity based in Bristol and used to be funded by MaPs to deliver debt advice work. They decided not to renew their contract with MaPs. I will be finding out their organizational reasons for letting such a contract go and what has been like since letting it go. I've also a trade union
Yeah, so I actually originally worked in the finance sector, and we regularly referred our clients to Step Change and other debt charities. And I wanted to use my experience I'd had working with people on the finance side, and actually use that to do social good, so to help people, rather than being part of the system that got people into further debt.
But what was the journey for you undergoing in the debt advice? What was it like for you?
It was quite quick in terms of when I started. It was about 6 weeks from getting the job, starting to actually being giving full debt advice sessions to clients, primarily over the phone.
And did you notice the difference that you're making in people's lives whilst giving debt advice?
Yeah. So when I first started, it was quite a lot of information. I did struggle a little bit, but as I got on, I really loved the working with clients and being able to sort of sit down and problem solve with them, do the budgets, and sort of find out a bit more about their lives, and not just on giving the debt advice, but signposting them to other charities and support where needed as well.
So at what point did you realize that things weren't working right for you?
FCA guidance was changing, and it was just impossible to keep up with the workload that was coming in.
At what point did you realize that I couldn't cope with this anymore?
So I came back off. I actually went on maternity leave, and I came back. I was doing it for a few months, and I actually fainted on the job a couple of times. just from pure exhaustion, partly from home life, having a baby, but also the workload was just too much and too intense really for me to handle.
Now, you talked about workload being too much, but debt advice work is also very kind of prescriptive. You have to follow a structured process. How do you deal with that?
It was mainly with the rise of the cost of living, the toolkit that we sort of usually use, the number of clients that were on what we call a deficit budget, which is where they have more coming out than coming in. Instead of that being sort of once or twice a month, it was becoming a daily occurrence. And I was feeling less and less able to actually support people and give them the option they needed, which is what I liked most about the job.
Since you've moved out of, I suppose, debt advice sector, and has there been a change in your frame of mind, your mental health? How things have changed since?
Back of the scenes sort of support, but the impact it's had on my mental health and my physical health as well has been, I can't really put it into words because it's been a huge change. You know, everyone I know who sees me are like, "Oh, you don't look ill anymore. You look a lot more lively. You look less drained." I do think it can, particularly at the moment, with the conditions that advice is in at the moment, I think it can be very draining on people.
I know you didn't directly work under MaPs' contract, but you knew others who have. What have they said to you so far?
Well, most of sort of my ex-colleagues that did don't work in debt advice anymore, or they've moved into sort of community non-MaPs funded contracts, but those are quite few and far between. A lot of people I know have actually moved to the NHS because it's less stressful, which is ironic. I know about 5 or 6 people that have changed to other social care providers, that kind of work.
Tanis, thank you for sharing your experience. Let me move to Tamara Manning, co-CEO of Talking Money. Tamara, based on what you've heard from Tanis, what is your first impression?
Well, it's very similar to what we heard here.
Organizationally, what was it like before you decided to say enough is enough?
So we felt like the MaPs funding had taken over the whole organisation. Although they only funded some of our work, the levels of bureaucracy and control over the work meant that the only way to deliver the contract was to skew our whole organisation to meet their requirements. And really, we felt that we were spending a significant amount of time and money doing work that was required by MaPs, but that was not valued by the clients that we were trying to help. And that's what really drove us to make our decision. we actually felt that we'd lost our independence and our integrity as a local charity.
So you mentioned briefly around how much work needed for a case, but in terms of strategic decision, what were you thinking? What was going through the minds of your trustees, senior managers, and advisors before deciding which way to go?
So we'd been having conversations for a few years before we made our final decision. Once we started to see how unhelpful the MaPs contract was from a client's point of view, we started to ask ourselves whether it was the right thing to do to continue with it. The first time that the leadership team raised the idea with the staff team, they were actually against the idea of ending the contract. But then when the MaPs contract went out for recommissioning, there were significant differences, including the size of the contract, which meant that Talking Money would no longer be in a position to be a lead agency. And we would need instead to join a new lead and a new project, and we would be a delivery agency only. And there was a different relationship as well between payment and performance. And I'm putting performance, as you can't see, in little speech marks here, because it's performance from a MaPs point of view, not perhaps performance from a client's point of view. Let's put it like that. So their terms of performance might not be what we think was valuable. But I mean, really, we're talking about targets and numbers of people, names on a box, ticks in a box. So that link was going to put the organisation under increased financial risk as well. And with that, actually, the staff team came to see that this position wouldn't work for Talking Money, and that the added requirements and demands from MaPs that seemed to be continually increasing meant that advisors had reached the point of feeling more demoralised and essentially untrusted and disrespected as highly experienced and skilled professionals. And that led us to a position where both the advice team and the leadership team, with support from the trustees, we all agreed that the best outcome would be to end the relationship.
So when you decided to end the relationship, inevitably conversation moves towards whether there'll be redundancy or not. So how was that dealt with? How did you have that conversation?
It was difficult, I have to say. It meant that we had to go through a redundancy process and a restructure process. Most of the Money and Pension Service project management team that were employed by Talking Money were offered roles by other lead organisations. So actually only one of that member of the team was made redundant, and that was due to her living in France. So that couldn't be overcome. For the other people at Talking Money who weren't directly managing that project, we had to carry out a restructure, and that we decided to focus our resources on keeping as big a frontline advice team as possible. So we were reducing the central support roles around them. It was a sad and difficult time for everyone involved, and the job losses weighed heavily on the leadership team and the trustees. And actually, I mean, that up until the time we made the decision had been our biggest barrier to leaving MaPs.
So since you left MaPs' contract, what has been the culture at Talking Money since?
Now, and up until March 2025, that's projected to be 30 million. So it's in numeric terms slightly lower, but of course, factoring in the big jump in inflation in that time, it's equivalent to about a fifth less. So we've got more people needing debt advice, a lot more people needing much more complex advice, and that is a pattern reported across the sector. The complexity of cases is much greater. So there's greater demand on the community-based services, and yet their slice of that pie is much smaller than it was. So really, MaPs could, I'm sure MaPs and DWP could spin the figures in different ways. Yes, there's more money going in, but it's nowhere near enough. It hasn't increased proportionate to the increase in demand. Step change saying over the last year, a 1/3 increase in their client numbers, January to January. Over the same period, debt assessments for new clients at Citizens Advice going up by 88%. So the demand is rocketing. The funding is not rocketing, and it is due to drop slightly over the next couple of years.
So from the point of view of Unite the Union, what do you want to see happen then? What's the argument?
There's an argument certainly about how the funding is divided up, who gets what, how that is structured, definitely. But there's one big overarching demand, which is that there needs to be a lot more money coming in. We can't pay for everything we want at the moment using the money that's coming in. So before we get into that, we need more funding, and there's a very obvious route to get that. Now, the principle, sometimes referred to as polluter pays, the principle that the organisations which cause the problem should pay to fix it. And that's well established in debt advice. The MaPs levy at the moment applies that idea. It takes the levy from consumer credit and home finance providers and uses that to pay for debt advice. But they're a shrinking part of the debt advice problem, of the debt problem. We've seen over the last few years that consumer credit lending is shrinking as a proportion of debt problems, and a much bigger part is utility debt, rent, council tax, priorities. And yet they don't pay towards the debt advice levy. So energy firms, which have been a huge driver of debt problems, the biggest single cause, I would imagine, in the last year. Yes, some of them do some ad hoc charitable things, but they don't pay into the levy. They don't pay their fair share to fix the problem. So our argument is, we've got organisations like Centrica made £3.3 billion last year. EDF made £1.1 billion last year in profits. Their profits are shooting up. Our prices as consumers are shooting up. There is the space there for those large firms to pay more towards debt advice. So our argument is the levy should be increased. The banks can afford to pay more, and the levy should be expanded. Currently, the legislation only allows the levy to be applied to FCA authorised firms. So we're arguing that should be expanded so that a larger range of creditors can be called on to share the financial burden of paying for advice. And of course, advice ultimately is profitable to the taxpayer. So every pound that goes into paying for advice services saves the taxpayer multiple pounds. Some Scottish figures just published today saying there's a 1 in 11 ratio in Scotland. Pay £1 into debt advice, that saves £11 in expenses elsewhere. So there's a cast iron case for this.
I mean, speaking of advisors and debt advisors in particular, the debt advice sector on the whole isn't as unionized compared to, let's say, the National Health Service or the Teachers Union. What are you trying to do to raise awareness about unionization, since you're a trade union man?
Right. It's not. There's several reasons for this. We don't have in the voluntary sector, there's not the same long-term history of trade unionism that there is in a lot of public sector workplaces. It's harder to build something from scratch. But the structural barriers as well, the advice sector, much of the voluntary sector, is made up of small workplaces, often people on sort of fixed-term contracts. There's a lot of job insecurity, which means people are often changing jobs quite quickly, and that makes it harder to establish those bonds in the workplace, which leads to an effective union presence. There's other things as well. There's a culture, I think, that a lot of people in the voluntary sector maybe worry about pushing for improved pay and conditions themselves, and the kind of misapprehension that somehow that's taking away money from the mission of their organisation. There's an almost, I think, an acceptance of really poor pay and terms because people don't want to, they feel guilty about that, and that's absolutely wrong. And sadly, we know there are some organisations, some employers who are very, very supportive of the trade union movement. There are some organisations in the voluntary sector, certainly in the debt advice sector, which are institutionally anti-trade union. So that can be a barrier as well. But in every sector, in every workplace where there's an effective trade union that sticks up for its members and sticks up for those members' interests, they started from somewhere. And that's what we're aiming to do. Unite Debt Advice Network was an early attempt to do that. We link people up across workplaces so they can share their concerns. They can they can decide on what they want to sort of campaign on collectively across a lot of workplaces, and that's been quite effective. That's something we're very keen on building. And in Unite, our general secretary is pushing the concept of combines. So it's this idea of creating networks across a sector to campaign collectively for the interests of people in that sector. So that's the route to improve things, I think.
You organised a demonstration actually last month outside DWP's headquarter, also in front of Treasury's building and outside MaPs' building. What's next?
Well, that was an important point, because that's the first time that advisors have campaigned, certainly over the last couple of years, for improvements to funding, and very effectively. Remember that it was pressure from grassroots debt advisors, ultimately, which caused MaPs to suspend its catastrophic recommissioning exercise in 2021. So 17th of December 21, that was stopped as a direct result of the interventions of debt advisors. So we've done effective campaigning, but the idea of public campaigning is a novelty. It's the first time that's happened. It's an important step because it publicizes what we're doing. It reaches out to people who might not understand the issue, might not have come in contact with the issue. And it's a big morale boost, I think, for people to see, look, I'm struggling in my workplace, but I know there's people standing on the steps of the Money and Pension Service representing my interests. And when people can see that a union is out there fighting for them, then they want to get on board and they want to join in that fight and fight for themselves, fight for their colleagues. So it's an important step, but it's not. That's not the answer. It needs political engagement. It's a problem that will only have a political solution because it needs ultimately changes to legislation.
You were an advisor for a very long time. How has the advice sector has changed since?
I was first an advisor in 2004, so it's getting on 20 years. Immeasurably. I mean, the funding there's more money coming in, but the funding is chaotic compared to the Financial Inclusion Fund, for example, the pre-money advice service funding. We didn't hear these complaints. the degree of micromanagement is much worse. The lack of trust in advisors. But the big problem is the household debt landscape. I mean, deficit budgets, they happened, but they were rarely unfixable. I look back 20 years and I think it was not often I had a client where, we couldn't sort out a deficit budget. It might have been benefit claims or grants or something, but there was usually a way around it. And the really demoralizing thing that debt advisors have to face now is the amount of clients where there simply isn't a solution now. And I think that really wears people down. So that's the big change. We can't promise to fix every problem like we could in the past.
Thank you, Michael. I did say earlier that I approached MaPs and they declined my invitation. However, they have kindly asked me to read their statement on Debt Talk. This is what they have said. We've taken additional steps to improve debt advisors' experience of working in the MaPs funded organizations. This includes changes in our approach to quality and standards, recognizing well-being in contracts, developing our evidence based on changes in case complexity, and creating a debt advisor panel. Debt advice can be life-changing and more people will need it over the coming months. Some will be particularly vulnerable, and we are confident that this approach to debt commissioning will meet the needs of those who use these services. All of the organizations we're funding and those we've funded in the past provide excellent debt advice, and they all have an important part to play in meeting the growing need. This is a statement from MaPs. So before I conclude this podcast, I would like to invite my panel members to give my listeners a few tips on debt. So let me start with Tanis. What tips would you give on Debt Talk?
Well, for advisors, I would say you do need to prioritize yourself in order for you to give the right advice. So, look at your mental health. For me, I think the biggest impact was joining Unite. Look, even if you have a brilliant employer, the support that you can get from the union is sort of irreplaceable. So join usually Unite, Unison. There's a few unions you can join. And the other thing, you can only support one client at a time. So you do need to be, if you feeling overwhelmed, be firm, just focus one at a time and do it, do it that way. In terms of people who potentially could be in debt or looking for advice, I would say still, don't worry about, am I going to put too much pressure on the advisor? We would much rather have people come talk to us. It's not targeted at the client. We want more clients to actually seek debt advice, ideally early on in the journey. So even if you don't need a solution, the act of sitting down with an advisor and putting a budget together can potentially prevent you getting into problem debt as well. So yeah, please use the services if you feel you need to.
Tamara, how about yourself?
Well, I'd echo what Tanis said about advisors telling yourself you can only help one person at a time. I thought that was really good advice, because certainly my experience is when it goes wrong is when you're trying to help too many people. And I think I would say to listeners who are dealing with their own debts, find a way to focus on them, tackle them. They're not, sadly, going to go away by themselves. Try speaking to organisations that you owe the money to. Plan out what you want to ask for before you make the call and stick to offering what you can afford. Get advice where you can. I know that advice services are really overstretched, so it's really, really difficult. But for those that can use the internet, there's some good self-help websites out there with lots of information. We recommend National Debtline for that. So if you can get the information and then advocate for yourself, you're going to be in a stronger position. But yeah, certainly act is my top tip.
And finally, Michael from Unite?
Yeah, not lots to add to that. I think that's all very good advice. I think to debt advisors, yes, look after yourself. I never get tired of telling debt advisors what an incredible job they do, and I've met some people who just inspire me every day in dedication, and their care. They're just, I mean, fantastic people, but you need to safeguard yourself. You need to look after yourself to keep that going. And echoing Tanis's point, join a union, not just to protect yourself, but to protect your ability to help other people. And look, although the sector's not strongly unionized yet, look at organisations like Shelter, like Hestia, in Hounslow, like St Mungo's, which have active, vibrant unions and have improved things through that. So there is pockets of strength in the sector there. To clients, I think again echoing Tamara and Tanis's point, seek help, seek it early, and yeah, be careful of the internet. And another the sharks of the IP, the IVA providers out there. I think be very careful who you select. Go for a debt advice channel that meets what you need, and if that's face to face, if it's telephone, you go for what you need.
Well, I want to thank my panelists for taking part on Debt Talk podcast. For those who are listening to the podcast, I want to share your experience. You can get in touch with me on Twitter at yourdoctordebt, or email me ripon.ray@yourdoctordebt.com. Next month, the subject matter is going to be mental health and debt during the cost of living crisis. And I would like to thank my listeners for listening to this podcast with me, your host, Ripon Ray.